2024 at 10 a.m. So we're going to start off with the Pledge of Allegiance. Director Jennings, lead us in that, please.
Please stand and salute if you're able. Pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Next up, roll call.
Good morning, thank you. Director Branscombe, absent. Chapman.
Here.
Early. Here. Howdeshelt. Absent. Jennings.
Here.
Joyner.
Here.
Sander.
Here.
Vice Chair Gog.
Yes.
Vice Chair Lauren. Here. Chair Bradford.
Here.
And ex officio member Aceves.
Here.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone. Before we move to public comment, do you have any introductory remarks?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Chair Bradford. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you have good use of your July. We had a great trip to Denver. For those of you that were able to join us, it was really fantastic. We're going to do a presentation, a debrief. We had over 20 board members join us in Denver, which was fantastic. And we also had 5 folks in the development community. We did invite them to come to the committees. We didn't have room on the August board agenda. We couldn't get anybody today, but we'll have somebody this afternoon. One of the developers will have somebody again at the policy committee coming up. If you were there, and I know some of you, many of you were not able to join us from this committee, but if you were there, please weigh in when we get to the item on Denver. But I think the story from Denver was incredibly relevant based on what you had just done in terms of talking about growth and land use and housing and jobs and adopting the final land use scenario in June, and then going to Denver and seeing a lot of the very incredibly ambitious things they have done around redeveloping the airport into what's now Central Park, redeveloping an old mall that is literally the acreage of the Sunrise Mall in Citrus Heights. We had Director Schaefer videoing in real time as he walked around, being inspired. But also from a transportation perspective, the Denver region, in some ways, even just population-wise, you could say we are now where Denver was 20 years ago. And when Denver was 20 years ago, was looking at incredible congestion, not enough money to actually do all the things they wanted to do from a transportation perspective. So if you know the story, one of the things they did was they passed a regional multi-county sales tax. So they both increased their revenue after trying 3 times and failing twice and succeeding the last time. But they also kind of right-sized and I think thought differently about transportation in terms of the projects that they could really take on and afford to do. And we saw that as we heard from the sort of Colorado DOT about their managed lanes program, their toll roads around Denver, their bus rapid transit down the middle of the US 36 from Boulder to downtown Denver. And so to connect the dots between what you're going to hear this morning, we're talking a little bit and kicking off the transportation portion of the blueprint. Right, which is what are our investments? Where are we heading? How much revenue and money do we have? Even if we're successful on some of our local tax initiatives, in our case in Placer and Sacramento counties, but also how do we right size? How do we actually right size? Because we don't have enough money, even if we're successful at increasing revenue to do all the things we said we want to do, right? So we're kicking that discussion off today. And again, I think the Denver lessons are incredibly relevant. This afternoon at the Land Use Committee, we've got our toll authority CARTA meeting at the noon hour, and at the land use committee, we're also going to get a presentation around attached housing. So we're going to dive deep at the land use committee into what's our record on attached housing. We've done a couple of focus groups with developers here in this region about what would it take, what are the impediments to more attached housing, either affordable or market rate. And again, I think we've learned a lot in terms of some of the lessons from Denver and the product type there. And yes, other states are always different, but if you were in Colorado with us, you also heard how remarkably similar some of the regulatory and the policy frameworks are there. And then that all rolls into the board meeting in August, in 2 weeks from today, where we will have a workshop specifically focused on transportation. We'll dive deep into some of the state policy in transportation. We have a speaker from CalSTA, the California State Transportation Agency, and we got Celia McAdam, former executive director of PCTPA, kind of giving us the take on where's this going? How do we right size projects? Can we widen highways and roads? What's the future pricing and tolling? All of that is going to be what we'll dive into in the August workshop. So I just wanted to welcome you back, give you a sense of today's agenda, this afternoon's agenda, how that tees into sort of the transportation phase of the blueprint that's coming up. And then because Lynette would be really mad at me if I didn't remind you all, we are starting at 9 a.m. in 2 weeks. So we're going to do the board meeting starting at 9. And that is because we anticipate and have had some good, as we say, robust discussions. We anticipate another one in August. We want to get you out before noon. So please, we'll remind you several times, but a 9 a.m. start time in 2 weeks. And with that, back to you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. Lynette, any housekeeping items from you?
No housekeeping items.
Okay, we'll move on to public comment then, please.
There's no public communications.
Okay, seeing no public communication at this time, we will move on to the consent agenda. Are there any board members that would like to pull an item for discussion? Okay, seeing none, any public comment on consent?
There's no public comment.
Okay. We have a first from Director Gog, and I wasn't sure who came in first with the second, so, okay. Dr. Lauren?
Yeah.
Okay, so all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, motion passes. Next, we'll move on to the action items, starting with item 3, public hearing 2025 MTIP, amendment number 1 to the 2023 MTP SCS and air quality conformity analysis. Morning, Miguel.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Perfect.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Miguel Mendoza. I'm an analyst here at SACOG. And the item I have before you today is an action item, and we're requesting for the Transportation Committee to hold a public hearing to receive comments on the draft 2025 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program. I'll be referring to it as the MTIP going forward, and the accompanying draft air quality conformity document. Just as a brief sort of refresher on the MTIP, the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program, which can be referred to in other names and other jurisdictions or other MPOs, is a administrative document that lists transportation projects within the 6-county region that are funded by federal dollars. And so to borrow some imagery that James has used for the MTIP before, right? If we look at a transportation project being included in the long range plan as getting your ticket to a concert, right? The funding round is being a place where you can get your place in line. You can see how far you are from getting in and how close you are from getting in. And the MTIP would be getting into the concert. You're experiencing what you were there for. And I find that particularly good because it highlights a couple of key things about the MTIP. One being that the transportation list must be consistent with the long range plan. So in other words, for a project to be even eligible to enter into the MTIP, it must have been identified in the long range plan. Second, that the projects in the MTIP must have committed funding, right? You're in line, you either got funding awarded through the SACOG funding round or through another funding round, RAISE, infra, and the such. And the third, which I've been hinting at, it must be federal dollars. So if you have a project that even has $1 of transportation federal dollars, you must be included in the MTIP. All of that to say that the decisions have already been made before you even come into this document, hence the administrative part or description of it. And so we're asking for a public hearing. Why the public hearing, right? The MTIP is updated every 2 years in concert with all the other MPOs within the state. They are also updating their respective TIPs at this point. And as part of that update, of course, is a public review period, which allows for interested parties to submit comments through email, through our website, even a phone call, but also so that we hold a public hearing. Once the public review period is over, we will take all of those comments, incorporate them into the document, and we will come back to this committee and the board for approval next month. If approval is given, we submit these documents to Caltrans, who bundles them all up into a statewide one and submits them to the Federal Highway Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency for approval. And that is tentative approval date is December 16th of this year. So with that, that was a very high level description of it. That concludes my remarks. Happy to answer any questions you might have on it.
So I'll open the public hearing. Any board comment or questions? Okay, seeing none. Any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
Okay, I'll close the public hearing and entertain a motion.
Lauren will move the item.
Okay. Okay, a motion by Director Lauren and a second by Director God. And all in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great, motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll move on to item 4, bike rack ownership transfer to the city of Sacramento. Morning, Victoria.
Good morning. I'm Victoria Cacciatore, a transportation analyst here at SACOG. This item is to request approval of up to $75,000 of SACOG managed funds to support the city of Sacramento activities with bike share infrastructure, specifically bike racks. So SACOG has worked on bike share with the cities of Sacramento, West Sacramento, and Davis since about 2015, when we assumed the program from the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. And we had a launch of a pilot system in 2017 and a broader system in 2018. We worked a lot with our city partners who were very flexible through the development and launch of the bike share program, adapting to new best practices and then most notably industry changes, including a change in the operating model for our regional bike share pilot. When the region changed our assumed bike share pilot model to be privately owned and operated bikes instead of having publicly owned and operated bikes, the SACOG board approved using the bike share funds to install supportive infrastructure like bike racks and in-street bike corrals or docking stations. So there would be safe places to check in bikes and later scooters as those made their way into the market. So SACOG had purchased that equipment that was installed within the different cities, and we have worked to transfer these assets to the cities in which they're installed. We've already worked out agreements with the city of Davis and West Sacramento to transfer ownership of their infrastructure from SACOG to them. As we worked on the agreement with the city of Sacramento, they asked for financial help since not all of the locations that were selected for the 2017 pilot system 2018 launch are still working within the rapidly changing cityscape. So we worked with them to determine the funds that would be eligible to cover the work they needed to do. We found that CMAQ is eligible for part of the work, which is great because that is the funding source that we have supporting the bike share program, and that it wouldn't cover all of the needed activities, and that we had a fund type within our SACOG managed funds that would be able to fund those activities. So we see value in this solution because it is helping one of our program partners wrap up that that phase of the bike share pilot program. And it is also helping SACOG remove the liability of owning this installed infrastructure. So today I'm asking for your recommendation to the board to approve up to $75,000 of the SACOG managed funds. No, we don't expect it'll take that much, but the city will need to get the exact dollar amounts after they bid the project to know how much SACOG managed funds they would need. We also have city staff here, Jennifer Donlin Wyatt, in case there are any city-specific questions about this request. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions from board members? Okay. Seeing
Yeah.
none. Oh,
Actually, so do we have so we're asking for up to 75,000. Do we have a general idea? Because you said we don't think it'll take that much. And I'll just say, I'm curious because if we're asking for 75 from SACOG first, and then you take the bids, I would be curious how close it gets to 75.
Well, it is our intention to come back to correct that amount. Since SACOG managed funds are currently unassigned, they're not assigned to the bike share pilot, they are not assigned to anything. We are looking to minimize the use of those. We know that from what we've discussed with the city of Sacramento, we have a cap of will not spend more than $75,000 combined of CMAQ, or the funding type we have in support of bike share, and the SMF SACOG managed funds together. As far as the exact estimates of how much it
Or
is,
ballpark, it doesn't have to be exact. I'm just curious.
yeah, I'm trying to remember from our calculations because it depended on how you broke it up. By one estimate, it might be 35,000, another it might be 50,000.
Okay,
I see Jennifer coming up, so she might have the down to the decimal.
thank you.
Good morning, Directors. Jennifer Donlin Wyatt, City of Sacramento. Tall person, Transportation Planning Manager. So we developed the cost estimates based on our experience with this type of work within the City of Sacramento. We're pretty confident it's going to be thereabouts up to 75,000. We do not expect it to be any greater than that.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I do have one other question just around the work that you did with City of Davis and City of West Sacramento.
Mhm.
Did they have the same requests or similar requests, or how did those work and this didn't?
They did not have any comparable requests. All of, to the best of our knowledge and what they'd shared with us, all of the existing locations were still working out as originally intended.
Huh.
So they didn't have any needs for modifications that they shared with us when we discussed transferring ownership to them.
And honestly, just last question on that, was it shared that there was this potential, that if there were needed, changes, or if there were any issues that they should share it with you?
I was not part of those conversations, so I'm not able to answer. I'm not sure.
Yep, thank you.
Go ahead, Director.
Just from the timing standpoint of the transfer to West Sac and to Davis, can you tell me on the timeline, when did that take place?
For transferring to Davis and West Sacramento, I think those were completed in 2021. Yeah, 2021.
Both of them were completed in 2021?
Yes.
And is there a reason that it has taken us 3 years to transfer the last one to Sacramento?
As part of an agreement with Lime, who was operating exclusively in the area with bikes at that time, they assumed the ownership and liability associated with the bike racks between when those racks were transferred to City of West Sacramento and where we are today. Lime, our agreement, SACOG's agreement with Lime ended at the end of 2023. And that is why we're now addressing this issue with the City of Sacramento.
Okay. So with that information, and if there are no more questions or conversation, I'd like to move the item to transfer to the City of Sacramento, the bike rack ownership. I had the opportunity to speak to my staff, and they think it's an excellent idea, and so I'd like to move the item.
30 seconds.
Okay, I have a first and a second. Any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, item passes. Next, we will move on to the informational items, starting with number 5, the Transportation Project List Development for 2025 Blueprint. Morning, Zai.
Let's get this working here. Good morning, everyone. Zach Miller, Program Manager for the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategy, or the 2025 Blueprint. So the presentation I'm going to be giving today will really focus on the development and the refinement of the transportation project list for the 2025 Blueprint that James was mentioning earlier. So as part of this presentation, I'll start with some questions that I would like you all to keep in mind as I go through the presentation so that we as staff can get your feedback and input on the process. Then I'll be diving into steps that have already been completed as it relates to the transportation project list. And next I'll touch on what we're working towards. And finally, we'll discuss the approach we're taking in developing that transportation project list. So as I go through this presentation, please keep in mind that the need for the process that staff is currently undertaking comes out of the fact that we simply don't have enough money necessary to build all of the transportation projects that were nominated for inclusion in the 2025 Blueprint. And I'll go into some additional detail on that later in the presentation. So we as staff are in the process of developing and refining that transportation project list. for the plan. And from the presentation and discussion today, we're really looking for you all to provide feedback and ask any clarifying questions you may have on that process. So I'd like you all to keep in mind the following discussion topics as I present. So one, are there any questions, any clarifications on the process that staff is undertaking to develop this project list? And then, and this will make more sense as I get further along in the presentation, are there any missing questions that would help weigh the project's alignment with the triple bottom line? And as I mentioned, further along in the process, I'll get into more depth on that specific item. So let's start off with where we've been. In terms of the process and engagement to date, we've gone over these steps, at least a number of these steps, a number of times earlier this year. So I'm not going to revisit every single one of them. I would like you to note those items that will be informing what we'll be talking about today, though. That is the development of the transportation project list, obviously. So first and foremost, as I'll be outlining later in the presentation as well, the triple bottom line framework of equity, economy, and the environment, along with the policy statements within that framework, is what has guided not only the development of the land use assumptions that we talked about at length earlier this year, but it's also informing the transportation project list development that we're talking about here today. So starting out in 2022, SACOG staff worked with transportation project sponsors to review and nominate projects for inclusion in this plan, the 2025 blueprint. So this was the very first step in the process of developing this list of transportation projects. So then moving on next, as part of development and evaluation of land use assumptions, or the discussion scenario, as you may remember it being referred to as, that you heard back in April, a very scaled back, and we kind of called it a skinny transportation network, was included and developed for the purposes of that effort. So this step primarily concentrated on ensuring that the land uses in the discussion scenario that you were all reviewing at that time were served by adequate transportation infrastructure, and that the transportation infrastructure and network made sense with that land use development pattern. Then, while the land use assumptions were being finalized earlier this year, SACOG staff continued to engage with transportation project sponsors in order to get their comments and suggested changes to the initial transportation list that was developed as part of the discussion scenario. So this engagement really consisted of a preliminary kickoff meeting and workshop that we held in March, where we invited all transportation project sponsors to attend, where we really went through what we were asking for, when we needed it by, and extended our offer to meet with any of these sponsors to discuss and to help them navigate the process moving forward. So SACOG staff held meetings with a large number of transportation project sponsors following that kickoff meeting, just to walk them through the process, help with any questions they may have, and just kind of really smooth that process. So ultimately, sponsors submitted at the beginning of May via email or via formal letter their requested changes or edits to that discussion scenario transportation project list. And finally, SACOG staff, following receipt of all of those transportation project comments from all the sponsors, we consolidated all the comments that were received and really started the process of refining that transportation project list, which I'll be taking a deeper dive into here in a few minutes. So in terms of where we're going, so with the goal of adopting the final scenario for the plan in November and the adoption of the land use assumptions for the plan this last June, we now have really turned our attention to this last piece of the puzzle, which is the development and the refinement of the transportation project list. So looking at this schedule here in front of you, and that I think was also provided as a handout to you, we plan to adopt the final scenario, that being the combined land use assumptions and transportation project list, in November of this year. To that end, we'll be bringing you your first look at the transportation project list And that'll be coming to you in September at committee meetings as well as the board meeting. So today's presentation really looks to set the table for that September discussion by not only providing you with an update on ongoing efforts to develop this list for the blueprint, but also to provide you with the approach staff is taking to develop that list and to get your feedback and answer any questions you may have on the approach. So now let's get into how we're getting there. So at a high level, as I mentioned, as James mentioned earlier, we can't afford all the transportation projects that were initially nominated as part of that call for nominations in 2020. So we're going to need to start trimming the transportation project nominations significantly. So this presentation will really be focusing on the policy priorities that staff is using to do just that, kind of trim down that transportation list. So as I mentioned earlier, the process for developing the transportation project list has a lot of similarities to how the land use assumptions were developed. So this slide may look fairly familiar to you. So in developing the transportation project list, it's a must that we demonstrate fiscal constraint. That's a requirement of this plan. And then it's also a must that we achieve the greenhouse gas target. Then after those two musts, then we look to optimize the plan for the triple bottom line policy goals, and then also for local feedback and priorities. So I'm going to be going into more depth on each of these different components and aspects of the approach in later slides, but this is the general framework and really the general approach we work from in developing the transportation project list. So first, I'll dive into the musts that I just mentioned. So the first of which is that the plan must demonstrate fiscal constraint. So what is fiscal constraint? So fiscal constraint really refers to the requirement that the financial resources available are sufficient to cover the costs of the planned transportation projects and programs within the plan, the 2025 blueprint. So specifically, this means that the blueprint must demonstrate that there are adequate revenues from federal, state, local, as well as private sources to implement and operate the proposed transportation projects within the time frame of the plan. So within, that 2050 time frame of this plan. And then the concept of fiscal constraint really ensures that the transportation plan is realistic and achievable within the projected budget that we have to work with. And it prevents planning based on very, overly optimistic funding assumptions. So this table you see in front of you really compares the 5 major project categories from the adopted plan to very, very high level and preliminary estimates for the 2025 blueprint. Excuse me. So how this was done was we really took an estimated budget that we're kind of working with at this point of around 38 billion, say, which is what that's a very preliminary estimate of what the total budget could be. And we calculated the amounts of each budget category you see here using the same proportions as what was included in the last plan, the 2020 MTPSCS. So it's very coarse, very high level, but we just wanted to give you a better idea of the potential kind of budget that we're working with in these 5 major categories. So as you look at these numbers, note that while we have some flexibility with funding sources, using the proportions of spending to the last plan gives some sense of how much budget we're going to have to spread around in each of these categories. But I really want to kind of hone in on the roadway and highway capacity projects here. So as you can see, the total cost of highway and roadway capacity project nominations in the region greatly exceeds the funding for these projects in the last plan, as well as in initial estimates in this plan. It's on the magnitude of almost double of the amount of money we have. So this is all, I'll reiterate it again, this all means we can't afford all of these transportation projects that were nominated, and that we're going to really need to trim those nominations significantly for what's included in this plan. And the policy priorities that I'm going to be presenting here in a minute will show you how we are going to go about doing that. So then another must. So as you're well aware at this point, it's essential that we hit our greenhouse gas reduction target set for us by the state in order to remain eligible for large amounts of transportation funding. So I'm sure this map looks very familiar to everyone. It was included in many of the land use focus presentations earlier in this year. So this map uses the metric of vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, as a proxy for greenhouse gas emissions to really demonstrate how the land use pattern adopted by the board in June would perform. So as you'll recall, we're estimating that the adopted land use assumptions paired with the preliminary discussion scenario transportation network, and this was all presented back in April, as well as a number of greenhouse gas reduction strategies, will get us to around 1% short of achieving our greenhouse gas target. And that's very preliminary estimates on our part. So this is all to say that as part of development of the transportation project list, it's essential that the transportation investments that we're including in this list and in the plan serve the land use pattern that was adopted by the board in June. And this is really to ensure that we're maximizing the greenhouse gas reductions associated with that land use and transportation connection. And then I'm sure you recognize this graphic as well. So here you can see the relative VMT efficiency of the different community types that are included in our plan. So future development is going to occur in all of these community types throughout the region during the time frame of this plan, and that's reflected in the land use assumptions that were adopted. And as you can see, some of these community types are much more efficient than others when it comes to VMT as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So it's going to be especially important to ensure that the transportation investments that are included in the plan are supportive of our land use development pattern and do not result in any erosion of those preliminary greenhouse gas estimates, which if we erode any further from and get any further away from that target, it's going to make it really difficult to hit our greenhouse gas reduction target. I'll also note at this point that we're working with the Air District to come back as soon as October for a deeper discussion on greenhouse gases, VMT, as well as greenfields, based on some of the discussion and feedback we've received from the board and committee meetings in the recent past. Now I'll be jumping into the optimization aspects of developing this transportation project list. So, as I discussed in the initial call for transportation projects earlier this year, we began phase one of a more focused transportation project sponsor engagement. So this phase of the sponsor engagement really focused on input and comments on the very first iteration of that project list, that being the discussion scenario transportation project list. So this phase began with SACOG staff holding the workshop, presenting to the project sponsors and really walking them through the process. Then we held meetings with transportation project sponsors to answer their specific questions, help them navigate the process. And this all culminated with sponsors submitting their input as well as their comments on the transportation project list in May, as I mentioned earlier. Then we took all that input, we consolidated it, and we began using it to help inform decisions on further developing and kind of refining this transportation project list. So it's important to note here, and I'll be getting into this in more depth in a minute here, that while the local feedback from transportation project sponsors is used to inform the process, it's not the only consideration taken into account when deciding whether individual projects should or should not be included in the plan. So the next step in engagement with project sponsors will be initiating phase two of that process. And this is going to be begin probably later this month in August, and it's really going to focus on the draft final scenario transportation project list that you all will be seeing in early September. So this second phase of engagement will be project sponsors' final opportunity for input on the transportation project list as we work towards adoption of the final scenario in November. Now I'm going to be jumping into the optimization for the triple bottom line and those policy-based priorities that we're using to develop and refine the transportation project list. So as I mentioned earlier, we have far more transportation project nominations than we do reasonably available funding to build all those projects. So we need to find a way to trim the nominations significantly. And the triple bottom line policy framework, in addition to fiscal constraint that I just went over, needing to hit our greenhouse gas target and incorporating local feedback and priorities is how we're going about doing that trimming. So starting with equity, you can see on the left-hand side of the table, the triple bottom line policy priorities pulled directly from the framework. Then on the right, you can see the questions and overarching metrics that we're using to ensure that the specific policy priorities are being addressed through our process of trimming the transportation project list. So take, for example, the provision of access from under-resourced communities to essential destinations. So under-resourced communities are much more likely to be transit dependent for their mobility needs, and thus by answering the questions of if a transportation project helps improve transit access in such a community will help us inform inclusion of a specific project in the plan. Then also note the engagement with under-resourced communities was a big part of the public outreach and engagement efforts you all heard about back in, I think it was February. So from this effort, we received a substantial amount of feedback regarding a number of issues that directly pertain to this effort. And we captured that within some of the questions that are up here that we're asking of specific transportation projects as we consider them for inclusion in the plan. So a few of those are the need to reduce racial and economic disparities in the region, specifically as it relates to transportation, housing, and access to jobs and recreational opportunities. So that's some of the feedback we heard through our extensive outreach. And then the need to better connect and reinvest existing neighborhood and communities to provide better access to jobs, services, and recreation. So now moving on to economy. So in the triple bottom line framework category of economy, this table really provides the questions we're asking of individual transportation projects as we look to develop and refine that list. So if you look at the top here on the left under the triple bottom line policy priorities, you see the fix it first triple bottom line policy priority. So that's not included in a specific question or metric in the column on the right. However, we do account for this policy priority by focusing on existing needs, such as bottlenecks that occur today, and by prioritizing improvements on the existing system. So by doing so, we're really preserving funds that can help pay for maintenance. We're avoiding expanding beyond what we can repair and maintain, and we're getting co-benefits by making improvements on existing facilities. So additionally, in many instances, this fix-it-first approach is also reflected in local feedback and priorities that we receive during that engagement process with transportation project sponsors. So fundamentally, this policy pillar of the triple bottom line is being addressed through ensuring that the growth in the region is assumed as part of this plan and is being supported by the transportation network that will answer those questions listed on the right of the table in front of you in the affirmative. So we want to ensure that the transportation network at a high level, that we're developing this transportation network for this plan to enhance the transportation access to existing land uses, including jobs and services, and to ensure that future land use growth includes adequate and efficient transportation access. And then finally, environment. So in the triple bottom line framework category, of environment, we're fundamentally trying to reduce harmful tailpipe emissions, as this is a requirement of our plan that connects directly back to the must of achieving our state greenhouse gas reduction target, but also of addressing air pollution as part of the federal requirements of the plan as it relates to air quality conformity. So all these questions we're asking of individual projects that are listed in the column on the right will really help the region achieve those goals and requirements related to harmful tailpipe emissions. And finally, the same questions we're asking will also tie back to additional environmental benefits and co-benefits, such as preserving open space, preserving ag land, and working lands. So with that, I want to put those kind of initial questions that I had listed at the front of the presentation back up and open it up for any questions.
I'm sure there's some questions or comments. Okay, go ahead, Director Jordan.
So I continue to be, if I understood you correctly, you're using vehicle miles traveled as a proxy for greenhouse gas emissions.
Mhm.
I continue to be highly concerned about that because the emissions per mile of somebody in bumper to bumper traffic in Sacramento County is far greater than somebody doing 50 miles an hour down Highway 50 or 80 coming down from Placerville or Auburn. So I don't find that to be a valid proxy. I think we need to find a way to refine that to be more reflective of the actual emissions of the vehicles.
And I think maybe when I use the term proxy, it was more so just showing that there is some connection there, but we do in-depth modeling for it on the greenhouse gas emission side. And so it's captured within that emissions modeling as well at a much more refined level.
How can I see that? How can I review that?
That was included in the April presentation, and we can also, provide you with those tables as well.
Okay.
And that was what I spoke about being, about 1% short of our target. And so we can provide you that information.
So following up on Director Joyner's question, I know we've had this discussion often. We don't get to take credit for electrification. The state gets that credit. But similar to VMT being a proxy for greenhouse gas, as more people switch to electric, that proxy seems to become less and less reliable. Any comments about how that relates to the modeling and just kind of in general?
So that's attempted to be captured within the modeling,
Okay.
And some of the software and the kind of modeling methodology that's suggested and approved by the California Air Resources Board. And so as you mentioned, the state primarily takes credit for it, and to the degree possible, we account for that in our modeling.
Okay. Great, thank you. Dr. Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. A couple of quick questions. Can you remind me how the preliminary, on the slide adopted versus 2025 blueprint with the preliminary budget, how those dollar amounts were allocated, or why they're in those, the amounts are there? Like the 13 to 14 million for maintenance rehabilitation. When was that kind of range decided? Was that remind me that?
Yeah, so that was basically just taking the same proportions of how it was divided for the previous plan
Okay.
and then projected out for our
Right.
plan, just to give a kind of a rule of thumb and kind of a point of reference for this discussion. But that has not been decided yet for this plan.
Right. So I guess I'm curious if one of the musts that you lay out is meeting the greenhouse gas emissions, and as Director Joyner said, that's tied directly to VMT. When you look at the amount that's here, only a third of that funding is being dedicated to transit, bicycle, and pedestrian alternatives, which I would think in turn would help us meet that must. Can we talk a little bit about why those numbers there's not more dollars in those two amounts?
Well, I think one, maintenance and rehabilitation, obviously there's a huge need in the region, and across the state for maintenance and rehabilitation. It's local jurisdictions are having a tough time keeping up with the maintenance and rehabilitation of roads, highways, et cetera. And so that's just to maintain and, you know, get things back up to par in terms of the maintenance and rehabilitation. In terms of transit, bike and ped, and then the road and highway capacity. So the roadway and highway capacity, a lot of those projects are needed to serve the land use patterns. And as I showed in one of the slides, we still take into consideration congestion. So in areas where there is extreme congestion or an extreme need for, you know, maybe some capacity increasing, that is taken into consideration as well. But as I mentioned before, we have not decided on the final, you know, proportion of how these funds will be allocated.
Sorry, Clint Holtzen, Planning and Programming Manager. So I can add a little bit more nuance as well to that answer. I think it's probably pretty well understood here. All of the funding that comes to transportation has a stack of strings attached to it. Some of that is going to dictate where the budget goes. So a lot of like the LTF money that comes to our region goes into both transit and to road maintenance. So this is both reflective of policy decisions on the board of where you want to really focus, and maintenance was a huge part of the last plan. So we're looking to that. But then some of it is a reflection of there's a lot of general fund money, developer impact fees. Local funds make up about 2/3 of the total budget that go into this. A lot of those are driven by the development activities that happen in the region and are going into, you know, roadway projects, some transit projects. The operations of transit, it's a harder nut to crack to find sufficient funding. So we will have discussions about new measures. There's the new measure in Placer County that's helping to, if it passes, to help pay for some needed roadway projects, but also has some money for transit, some money for maintenance. And then there's a potential for a Sac County measure. And where that money goes, does it go into transit operations, will also affect these budgets. So it's a reflection of policy, but it's also a reflection of state, federal, and local kind of strings attached to those funds.
So Clint or Zach, can you also just remind us how much, is that status quo, or is there an expansion of transit that is assumed?
That is a pretty big increase in funding for transit over today. By the time we're out into kind of that last decade, it's probably looking at not quite, but close to a doubling of the daily operations cost of transit. Some of that obviously comes from inflation, but other is expanded service.
Okay, thank you.
I've got one more question. We talk about the triple bottom line being one of the factors that's going to be used to evaluate the projects. Is it kind of like if you meet all three items in the triple bottom line, then you're a high scoring project, or you know, if you do really well in one or two, but you don't check them all. So I guess I'm trying to understand, like, what, you know, if I do excellent in two of them, but I don't have any of the third, and I've got another project that, you know, scores in all three, which one kind of would be a higher priority? Just maybe kind of an understanding of the methodology of how that's evaluated.
Yeah, definitely. So we kind of develop these, you know, screening questions, if you will. And it's just that as you go through and, you know, you're checking the box on, you know, we say, I think we have 13 different screening questions related to these metrics, or these kind of overarching metrics that I discussed. And if the more boxes you check, kind of the higher the score, if you will. But there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of input as well on local priorities and, you know, local feedback that we receive too. So that's obviously incorporated in there as well.
Okay, so it sounds like it's a little more, I guess the word I'm going to use is subjective than maybe like a funding round where there's a numerical score that gets applied, and this, you know, these are the top 10 projects and they're the ones that get it. So
yeah, I think
okay.
that would be correct. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, yes.
I guess one added comment to my colleague from Davis is that line that said maintenance and rehab. Often when that occurs, you know, bike lanes are enhanced, pedestrian facilities are enhanced, transit might be more likely to be able to operate there. There are some rehab projects that are required in order to allow densification along the corridor. So there's a little bleeding between those different categories up there. Question for staff, though. Kind of a theoretical question. Bang for the buck with regard to like carbon emissions reduction. Director Joyner was sort of teasing at this a little bit. I guess I'm also curious about the transit bang for the buck. I think a lot of the assumption would be that that has a much bigger effect on carbon reduction per dollar invested. But given our intensely suburban development pattern in Sacramento, in other words, you know, a bus running through a neighborhood has to go quite a distance to get in touch with a certain number of people versus a more urban dense place. I'm wondering, do we score well with regard to other jurisdictions on the return we expect in terms of carbon reductions on a transit dollar invested?
I think indirectly, yes, because it all gets back to that land use and transportation kind of interaction that we were talking a lot about, you know, in the past few months related to the land use assumptions. So it's our land use and transportation, that combined kind of interaction there, and really the land use pattern is what gives us the biggest, in terms of the modeling, and gives us our biggest bang for the buck, right? And so more infill, more center development in centers and corridors and established communities will give you a greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And I say indirectly because if you do increase that density in different areas, you know, and I'm specifically thinking about established communities and or developing communities that haven't been fully built out yet, but are continuing to be built out. And that could maybe kind of shift to established communities at some point. Having that density will make transit much more efficient in those areas as well. And so I think the first step and the most effective strategy that we discussed back in April is that land use pattern, and ensuring that it's a bit more dense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. That's sort of a chicken and egg response, right? You need the transit so you can get the dense development. You need the dense development so the transit will be more successful.
Mhm.
And you hope that the synergy of the two, you know, has a greenhouse gas reduction. I was in a seminar not long ago where someone talking about transit said, if you're talking about an RD10 community, forget buses. It'll never be efficient enough. An RD10 community. Yeah, RD10. And I mean, that's Sacramento, right? I mean, we're not even RD10 all over the place. We're less than RD10 mostly. So it's always an interesting question for me, you know, like how much do you invest in transit in an environment that isn't naturally transit friendly versus how do you invest it in a way that you actually get the biggest bang for the buck, which is along corridors and in dense areas.
Sandra, I do think I want to emphasize what Zach said, right? Because you're asking a great question, which is what's the bang for the buck? What's the return on investment? We have limited dollars. And just to reiterate, I think everybody, land use, like that is why we spend so long. That's why we start with it. And as you saw from that VMT map, it is not just about dense urban, the core of Sacramento, right? It is actually about mixed land use. That VMT map shows up green and yellow on almost every community, right? In certain places, depending on development pattern. So the land use is key. One place I feel like we actually learned, it was, they were some heated conversations. So, you know, I don't know if we learned it or not, but certainly we should have learned is the analysis of the citizen initiative in Measure A, way back in 2022, when we did that. I think what I took away from that is, if you were to take away transit, if you were to subtract it, we're in a world of hurt. We need a level of service, a level of transit service. I don't think we can anticipate anytime soon, we're talking a 30% or 20% or even 10% mode share, but the transit we have now is really important. Where you can increase it effectively, I think is a much tougher question. Like, how do you move the needle in a positive direction? I think that is harder in our region because of, I think, of the things that you have said. But it also, again, I think it connects to Denver, it connects to the corridors, it connects to more frequent service. How do we make buses run more effectively? how can we speed them up? How can we use signalization and dedicated bus lanes and toll lanes and HOV lanes on the freeways, right? To think about a high-speed network for buses, right? We're a suburban region. And we do have, I think, a lot of opportunity on the bus side. There are other reasons other than GHGs to do transit that way and to do it more effectively. So we can't lose what we have. When we look at gains and increases and increases in levels of service, we should probably be thinking about it a little bit more holistically than just the GHG. I think, as you're saying, like we'll get for a while now, we're going to have limited, I think, upside unless we get land use. So I think that's what I took away from that analysis in 2022. Can't lose it, but we got to be thoughtful about how we sell the benefits of maximizing and doubling down on some of our corridors.
Yeah, when I chaired RT, and I don't know how many of you have served, not many of you have served on RT, I think, but there's a natural friction there between the choice commuter who's choosing to take transit and the social service aspect of transit, which is people have no other way to get around. And it's a constant tug of war between those two. Where do you put your funding? Do you serve the needs of those who have no choice, or do you try to attract the choice riders? And at that time, the analysis was who's buying a monthly pass was kind of a metric, which would tell you, how attractive are we to commuters? And the answer came back, it was like 98% of the monthly passes were provided by the state to state workers, which meant essentially nobody was by choice investing in a personal monthly transit pass. That almost never happened. So it was the system was vastly tilted towards commuters who had their pass paid for by the state or people who had no other choice. So that kind of refined, our thinking at the time. And I don't know, system-wide in all our jurisdictions, what those sorts of divides would look like now. But you're right in that you can't shift, you can't just eliminate and say, well, that's a great savings, we can reprogram. But the real question is, how do we smartly grow the system?
So one of the things.
It's just like growing it everywhere is not smart.
We can't keep promising we're going to extend light rail everywhere, right?
Yeah.
We'll have these conversations. However, I will tell you that as a region, we should be cheering for the new low floor light rail vehicles coming to SAC-RT that'll be unveiled, I think, in September, the 15-minute service to Folsom, right? So as you well know, because it runs through Rancho, but it runs through many communities. The Gold Line, as one example, right? Is that perfect when we get low floor vehicles that are not the 1980s model, but the 2024 model, when we get 15-minute service out to Folsom, all of that Gold Line corridor it truly is, per its name, it's gold. We should be thinking and doubling down on the investment, and like you're doing at Mather Mills, right? Every one of those stations is an absolute opportunity.
Anything else from board members? Okay. Seeing none, any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
Okay, we'll move on to item 6, recap of Denver, Colorado Peer Region Tour. Good morning, Mia. And it's Mia's on her way up. I just want to props to staff for this amazing trip and for, taking care of all the board members while we were there and just, rescuing us from an airline debacle.
Wasn't this
and,
study mission to Colorado Springs?
Right. Yeah, a side trip to Colorado Springs. Unfortunately, we didn't get to actually see anything in Colorado Springs other than the tarmac, but it was greatly appreciated. So
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was a ton of fun, and I'm really excited to be with you this morning to be able to share a little bit of insight about the tour itself. So I am Mia Lopez. I was part tour guide / attended the tour with you all. And I wanted to give an opportunity to share a little bit about what we learned and give board members who are on the tour a chance to share about what they learned on the tour. So Peer Region Tour, it's an opportunity to go and learn from other regions, hear from them, speak to the experts that are making projects happen, explore housing, infill, and transportation were all topics on the agenda for the 2 days that we were there in late June. And the reason that we chose the Denver region It's the capital of Colorado, 3.4 million residents. And also, it just kind of a glimpse into our future of the Sacramento region. There were several projects that we explored that have a hint of Sacramento, of projects that that are in motion, 10, 20 years from now, we can see ourselves in Denver region. We Before I go into that, there's also a lot of similarities in just like the challenges of the Denver region when it comes to funding, infill development, figuring out transportation, also housing, greenhouse gas emissions, all very similar to conversations that we have here. I just want to touch on a couple of the topics that we shared during our event. So we had a chance to learn about bus rapid transit in the Denver region. The Denver Regional Council of Governments gave us a great presentation about the partnership that they have between a number of different agencies for a very rapid, if you will, progression of bus rapid transit in the region. And we got to see a future line there of where BRT will be. We also heard about tolling in the Colorado region. We went to the Department of Transportation, Colorado Department of Transportation, to hear about their governance structure, public feedback process, how and equity in the system, to learn how it is all going together. So very interesting. We also met the Denver mayor, Mike Johnston. He came to join us as well for dinner and talk about his plans and visions and what they're working on in Denver. Great. Okay. Belmar Mall redevelopment in the city of Lakewood. This was an infill development project, replaces a 100-acre 1960s mall that started to lose its charm and tenants. Now it's a thriving, walkable community with townhomes, apartments, entertainment, and retail. We had an opportunity to walk through that community and also think about what the Sunrise Mall area could look like, in 10, 20 years from now as plans progress on the Sunrise Tomorrow. So it was really apples to apples there in terms of infill development for the Sacramento region. We also, there we go. Central Park is, sorry, I was too fast. Central Park, one of the largest infill development projects in the country, 7.5 square miles, used to be the site of a former airport, and now there's housing, townhomes, retail in this area that used to be a tarmac, essentially. So it was very cool to walk through the neighborhood, learn about the project and the evolution of how it came to be today. And then lastly, Loretto Heights, a historic preservation project. It is still under construction, but we had an opportunity to go inside. It used to be a former college. The Sisters of Loretto started it back in the 1800s, and it will be a cultural gathering spot for the city of Denver with arts and shopping, entertainment. So it was very cool to see and envision what it will look like in the future. So on that, it was just a wonderful educational experience. Thank you to the board members that were able to join us for this tour. We had board members, city, county staff, and also partners and developers who played an important role in building the future of the region. I'd love to open it up now to see if any board members who attended the tour with us have anything to share as part of what they learned and saw during this event.
Thank you, Mia. Some of the board members that were there wish to share.
Yeah, first of all, kudos to staff for a very well organized trip. You can't control the weather, so I ended up in Colorado Springs. It was, not only from the presentation at DRCOG and the various places we stopped. One of them we stopped at was on Capitol Hill, and that affordable housing project they did on, I think he said 20,000 square foot lot. So it was really the opportunity to see some of those things and then bring it back and Lauren Hawker with City of Roseville was with us, and I go, I think I see some commercial corridor opportunities that we're doing 3 commercial corridors. So to see that, to recognize we're not alone, right, in a lot of these things. In some instances, we're ahead of Colorado, their whole greenhouse gas and, their, what's the word I'm looking for? We're, as it is with California, a lot of things, and Councilmember Sanders knows this well, but we're on the leading edge or the bleeding edge, depending on whose pocketbook you're reaching into. But it was really good to have that perspective. I dropped off the second day, or last half of the second day, so I didn't really get to see Central Park, but it was just really, really good. And then the other thing that I think is invaluable on these trips, and I would encourage everybody to make sure that in their budgets, there is funding for these types of study missions, is the extended period of time you get to spend. So we're not dashing in here, looking at an agenda, trying to figure out what we're gonna mention. But the extended period of time we get to spend with each other on these trips is invaluable. We had some developers who asked, God, why can't I think of what's the right term? The headway in transit. Yeah, is it headway? We're asking some really insightful questions on this. We also had the new chamber executive, Sacramento Chamber Executive. So for me, the opportunity to look at these projects and then drop them like a monopoly piece in the city of Roseville and figure out where they fit was invaluable, but also the relationship building and the opportunity to be with others was invaluable as well.
Thank you.
Oh, one more thing. So, right, it's not all sunshine, but I stayed a couple extra days to visit with friends. I mean, to learn that Michael Saragoso spends an awful lot of time in there because his mom's down in Lakewood, I think, part of Denver. So, but I sent this to James because I was looking at the Denver Post afterwards, a couple of headlines. Drivers fined 42 million in 8 months for express lane violations. Whoops, all right. And then office glut not sinking lenders, but too many apartments might. So, everybody has their aspirations and their dreams and the implementation. And when I worked at Lennar, we had do, review, do, because you set your goal. If you get here, then you figure out what you need to complete that. So I think, looking how they continue to evolve and the challenges they face will be informative to the region as we move forward on things.
Sure, I'll go. Thank you. And thank you for all your work on the trip. And thank you, James, and your team for all the work you put into it. It was the first study mission I've been on since being a board member, and I had a great time. I learned a lot, and I was really appreciative of the opportunity to do it. I think one of the pieces, and you mentioned this earlier, James, stuck out to me, and you framed the conversation the very first morning at Dr. Cog, was this is basically Sacramento 20 years from now. And I think looking at that trip through that lens was powerful for me, because sometimes you go to those places like that in your own travel, and you think, how can you get there, right? You want to just have things happen immediately. And thinking of it in that lens of this is where we could be 20 years from now, I think was a powerful thing for us to do. And I think Director Hoboshaw talked about this. For me, the tours of the affordable housing apartments and complexes that stuck out to me when I came back and talked to our staff about some of the things they're doing there. I think part of it was this public-private partnership of 4 market rate developers moving into the affordable housing field, and the work that they're able to do around financing. And we went to one of the apartments right by the Capitol, and you could see the Capitol building from the affordable housing complex. And they talked a lot about how they're able to get those projects over the finish line and then maintain them in a way to where they have folks that are coming in and running it. We met the people that are the property manager who were there, and the work that they're doing to continue housing some of the most vulnerable people in their community, and how that would relate to the work that we do. And then I think the other part was one of the interesting pieces that we went to a couple other housing projects out by the football field. And they've really focused on having affordable housing, but also market rate housing in the same building. right? So you have market rate housing units that are there, and then right next to them is capital A affordable. And why they were doing that and trying to make the numbers work and not just having it be 100% affordable building. But as you said, they're facing challenges. Some of the ones that we went to, they're not full. They have a lot of housing there that they're trying to meet the needs, and most of it was on the affordable side. But I just thought it was something here that we do is, especially where I am, is we're looking at 100% affordable in all of our development, and this was a different approach to it. So that was stuck out for me as well. And just finally, I think, kind of the revitalization side of what we saw, the STEAM on the Platte, the work that they're doing there, partnerships with the city and land they're doing, it's just kind of re-energizes us to kind of step back and look at assets in our own community and finding ways to do some of that work. It was great, the co-working spaces. So really appreciative of this trip coming forward and all the work that you did to make it happen. And we missed you when you left. The jokes weren't as funny. Carm didn't, keep up all your sarcasm and witty humor. So thank you.
Thank you.
So all that training, but try to lead by example.
Okay, I've got a couple comments. It was great to have dinner with the mayor and have some time to talk with him, and also have kind of a more formal presentation from him at the dinner as well. So it was kind of a good mix of hearing from him, everyone could hear from him, and then maybe some individual time to talk with him as well. So the mall redevelopment, I thought was great, especially maybe in contrast to the airport redevelopment. I mean, often we maybe think, oh, you need this massive amount of land to do a project like that. And just in contrasting those two, one being a huge amount of land and the other being really much smaller, but being able to see, even in a smaller space, you can still do some really, really amazing things. And then tolling and BRT, obviously very relative to things that we're, working on at the beginning of here in this region and moving forward. And Loretto Heights, I thought was really cool and probably one of the most unique places I've seen on a SACOG study mission to really bring about, the ability to take something historical and work around it with new and redevelop, but keep that historical focus and that historical presence kind of central to everything that's going on there. And have any specific projects in mind related to something like that, but just kind of tucking that in the back as a potential amazing thing that can be done. I think these always, I go on these and I'm able to come back just really invigorated and excited about the potential opportunity we have across the region for all different kinds of things. And so that's a tremendous value. I think as mentioned by Director Habershelt, the relationship building that happens on these is absolutely outstanding and an important component of them. To really spend time with our fellow directors and with staff and on this trip with developers as well. I think having them there was great, both from a relationship standpoint, but also from, then they're seeing what we're seeing, and hopefully it's sparking ideas for them, and they're looking at kind of the possibilities from a different perspective. Really appreciate that it's so affordable, that staff works so hard to be able to make it so affordable that I think almost any jurisdiction could probably afford to go. And if you can't, you might even be able to come up with that money yourself. It's that affordable, and honestly, that I think worth it, right? So for $300, if I couldn't get my jurisdiction to pay that amount, I would probably certainly consider paying it myself. So anyway, great job.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Chair Bradford, yes. The last thing I'll close with, because I had the privilege to work in Denver for quite some time before I came out here. And I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to talk with the chamber there, the Denver chamber. But just to your point, first of all, I think there are a lot of great points you all made. One is you never go to a place and think they've got everything figured out, because if that's what you come away with, you're not going to learn anything, right? Everybody has their challenges. And so I appreciate those. But if it is 20 years ago, if the Denver region 20 years ago is kind of us today, one of the things I will never forget is before that regional 7-county sales tax measure that they failed on twice and got a third time, before they actually figured out the the new airport, right? Which if you remember the story, the old Denver airport and how bad it was, and then the Herculean effort and the controversy surrounding it. And now look at that airport as an economic generator for that entire region, which is really a global connection for them, right? That's what we're talking about here. 20 years ago, that region was having real problems, pointing fingers at each other, being parochial, not feeling like they had any common cause with neighboring counties or as a region. And it was actually civic and business leaders who pulled people together and actually behind closed doors and said, we have to get our act together, to put it nicely, or else we're not going to succeed. We're not going to win. And that is not by saying there aren't still many issues, right, that go city, suburban, county to county, right? But they really did hang together and pull together as a region. And I think it is a really important lesson learned. I don't think you got as much of that in the storytelling when we had many of the stories in Denver. That's an important one. And it's a very relevant one, I think, for us right now as a region. So anyway, I just want to just finally thank our staff because they did that. They took a lot of work into that, right? You pulled that off despite the weather and the Colorado Springs detour. But that was a great effort and a really excellent example, I think, of how our staff thinks about your experience and how to curate those trips and how to make sure we got the right speakers, right? So a lot of credit to all the staff. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move on to other matters. I know, Christina, you've got some things.
Yeah, I just want to kind of keep you all updated on some changes that are brewing with our active transportation program on the statewide side. So as part of some of the budget issues and budget cuts, we're looking at quite a significant cut in the amount of funding that we will have to administer our regional ATP program. There's nothing that obviously you need to do today, but we are going to be taking an item in September to the Transportation Committee and the board to make some changes to our guidelines based on the new information we have. So overall, I think the program lost about $400 million in this upcoming cycle 7, which means that the SACOG region is getting a total of $4 million, which is about a third of what we usually get. When we talk about the funding going towards construction of active transportation projects, that's pretty bleak in terms of what we can fund. So there's been some discussions with CTC on flexibility and how we use the funding, including potentially funding early stages or early phases of projects so we can actually use the funding a little bit more widely across a bunch of different projects. We haven't quite come up with a scenario or strategy. That's what we're going to be coming to you with in September, potentially, as well as just the changes we need to make to the guidelines. But wanted to make you all aware of that in case you start to hear information about that from some of your agency staff members. And just know that we're working on figuring out how we can do it. It is not an option for us to not use the funding, so we have to do something with it. That was obviously our first question. If we could roll it over to the next cycle, and we can't. So we are trying to work through this, but I wanted to kind of just give you a little heads up on that, that's coming. So if you do have any questions in the meantime that you're hearing from folks, please do reach out to either me or Summer Lopez on the team who's leading the ATP program for us, and we can get you some more information.
Thank you. Okay, any other matters from staff? Okay. Any board member comments or anything? Okay, well, great.
Well, yeah. Go do a shameless plug. August 16th, doing the State of the City, City of Roseville, we're doing it. I thought I was loud enough, Mr. Corliss. I didn't need this, but we're recording it. August 16th, we're doing the State of the City. I'm excited of when staff suggested that we do it on Vernon Street. Like in Denver, we went down Colfax Avenue, which was the old historic Route 40. So is Vernon Street, like Riverside, like Auburn Boulevard. And I'm excited because especially we have an awful lot of, as I previewed in when the board came to Roseville in April, there's an awful lot of redevelopment that has been a quarter century in the making that's happening there. Goldfields will be the site of the State of the City. There, the chamber will do a reception at 7:30 a.m. But we'll get a chance to showcase a lot of you know, a lot of where we can do RD10 kind of development and affordable housing. So August 16th, that's a Friday. If you want to wander into Roseville, please do.
Great. Well, I'm going to plug a local community event. So the biggest event of the year in my district, excluding what happens at Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in the amphitheater, is the Plumas Lake Block Party. And that's happening on the 17th. So you can go to Roseville one day and come to Plumas Lake the next day. So it has live music and vendors and games, beer garden. And I'll be pouring at the beer garden all afternoon and evening. So come up and let me pour you a beer. So.
You had me at beer.
So anyway, a lot of you guys want to come out in the country and kind of see what the world is like inside the city. I'm going to be picking peaches on Wednesday and bring your own bag. Not to take home, but to put in the bin. And I appreciate the free labor. Thank you.
That's awesome. Okay, thank you, everyone.